ora tātou, ko Ngāti Pākehā toko iwi, no Rotoro a hau, ko Piki Ganley toko inoa, e mahi ana a hau ki te rangahau ahu marakai ki te poki. So my name's Becky Ganley. I'm plant food researcher at Planted Food in Te Puke, and I'm a plant pathologist. So I've done, before joining Planted Food, I did a lot of research in forestry, and then more recently I've been very involved in myrtle rust. So you'll hear bits and pieces to do with my background coming throughout, and in particular I have a focus on fungi. So you'll hear that, but today I'm going to be talking about biosecurity under a changing climate. So it doesn't matter what crop, plant you're talking about, every single plant species in New Zealand or in the world has some kind of pathogen which impacts it in some way or the other. The impact of the pathogen can be really, really small and not cause much disease, but you might see little spots, or some might nibble the roots or do something. And it can go through to some really horrific disease issues. And this is an example of one of them. It's from Australia, of Phytophthora cinnamomo, which has just devastated entire ecosystems. And so these types of pathogens are really rare on the scale of all the microbes that are out there, but they are there, and when they do come in, they do cause incredible problems. So I'm going to be talking today a little bit about these three areas, and that is, will a climate change impact our current pathogen and disease problems? Can we expect new pathogens and disease problems? And what can communities do about these? So if I go for the first one, the answer is basically yes. So we're going to see under a changing climate that some diseases will become worse, but conversely, others will cause less issues. However, I'd say that we're going to have more that become worse than what we're going to have that become less of an issue. But it is a very dynamic situation. It's actually very similar to what Reese was talking about before with human health, a dynamic, complex part where lots of different factors get involved. Probably the biggest things with what ones will be worse and what ones will be better, it all differs by the pathogen, the region that you're talking about, and region can be globally, it can be New Zealand, it can be a region within New Zealand, or it can be a microclimate within a region. So it doesn't matter what scale you're talking on, those variations that you get in climate all impact, and it also depends on the host. So I'm going to give you a first example of what I'm talking about with kind of this variation that you can get. So this is Dothostroma needle blight, which is a disease on pines. We have it here in New Zealand, and it's also present globally. So it's one host and one pathogen. And so this map here shows a whole lot of different scenarios that were done under climate change and looking at the difference in effect. So all of the areas that come up pink are areas that become that are currently unsuitable, but under climate change will become suitable. All of the ones that are yellow are currently suitable, but under climate change will be unsuitable. And the blues are the ones that remain suitable. In general, everything that's yellow is where it's going to become so hot and dry that probably the trees are going to even struggle to survive. The ones that are pink tend to be areas that are covered in snow and will become more temperate. And then in general, this blue area is all of the temperate areas. So New Zealand is pretty small on the side there, but basically it's completely blue, and under the only areas that really change are the alpine areas, which will become more temperate and less alpine under climate change scenarios. However, that's just one pathogen, just one group of trees. Every single pathogen and host will be different. So it's all going to change. Some of them are going to increase, some of them are going to decrease. But just to kind of give you an indication of how much variation there is globally and then also within New Zealand. And I'll talk a bit more about New Zealand going forward. But today, rather than going along and telling you about every single different disease, I actually thought it would be better if I spent my time talking to you about what is going to be the drivers, what's going to cause this change in disease. And the first part for us as a plant pathologist is what we call the disease triangle. And so this is what the whole of plant pathology is based on. And when I've gone to talk to mana whenua kaitiaki, I find a lot of similarities in between how plant pathologists view the entire environment and Māori view of ngā here. And that's kind of which is really, really nice. We just have a slightly different way that we view it coming in from a pathology perspective, but overall it's kind of similar. So for a plant pathologist, if you want to get disease, you have to have a susceptible host, you have to have a pathogen, and you have to have a favourable environment. So the hosts and the pathogens are sort of separate entities, and the part that we potentially focus on the most is this favourable environment. And that environment is so critical and so important. And environment is everything. And that's that part where I see the commonality between when I've talked to mana whenua kaitiaki about, when they view the ngahiri. So it's microbes, it's the soil, it's the climate, it's all the different plant species that are in an area, it's everything combined. And you have to have all of those three things to get disease. And if one thing's missing, there's no disease. So it's sort of an all or nothing triangle. And then of all of the environmental factors that contribute, the ones that cause the biggest, or the ones that are the primary factors that cause disease are temperature and moisture. And so these ones are going to be really critical under climate change as well. I mean, clearly temperatures are going to increase and there's going to be a lot of variation in moisture. So there's lots of storms predicted, there's also droughts predicted, there's lots of different variables. But probably with pathogens, they do tend to like warmer temperatures. Having said that, there are a lot of pathogens out there. Red needle cast, which is another one we have in New Zealand that affects pine trees. Actually, its optimal temperature is 17 degrees, so it has quite a low temperature. But in general, most fungi prefer a warmer climate. They also like it to be moist, but moist doesn't mean lots of rain. So moist can be humidity. It can also be the amount of moisture that you have on the leaf. And it's not necessarily big storms itself, it's just sort of this general humidity and moistness that they have. So they are probably the biggest things. Then the other key factors which are related to climate change, there's been discussions about extended droughts, and for some fungi that's going to make it more of a suitable environment for them to become more problematic. The trees will be stressed, they can come in, but for other fungi, the stress that droughts cause to the trees makes them unpalatable, so they prefer a really healthy tree. For waterlogged soils, we've got a group of pathogens, Phytophthora. They're the ones that I mentioned at the very start with those pretty dramatic pictures from Australia, and we have it here with Phytophthora agathodicida, which causes Cody dieback. So Phytophthora love waterlogged soils, and so that's a real concern for that group of pathogen. And the name Phytophthora means plant killer, and there's a good reason why that group's been named that. They are particularly severe pathogens and particularly problematic, and there's not a lot that you can do about them. Then these things like severe frost and storms, the impact of these will be slightly different. They tend to provide a wound. There's certain fungi who like to be able to get into the plant through wounds that are created. And when you've got these kind of events that are increasing, you have potentially more opportunities for fungi to get into the host or other microbes or pathogens. Then there's things like host phenology changes, flowering and new flush. So if we've got a warmer climate, we're going to potentially be having flowering of some species occurring a lot earlier than we might have. We're potentially going to have new flush that's able to happen for a long period of time, which just means that there's more material for fungi to infect. And so there are those kind of changes. Then we also have the insect populations. And so there are some insects that transmit pathogens, either directly into the plants or indirectly to the surface of the plants. We've also got to lay on top of that, well, what is climate change going to have on the insect populations? Then also land use. So recognising that urban environments tend to be slightly warmer than other areas, a couple of degrees warmer. They're also frequently watered by people who are doing their gardens. So even though you might have drier conditions, in an urban environment you actually might not have such a significant change in your moisture levels. Then you've also got the productive areas. Some of them are irrigated, some of them aren't irrigated. The same kind of issues. If they are irrigated, you still might be getting a very high level of moisture in those environments. And then the natural environment. So it tends to be cooler than the other areas, but that's potentially going to be rising with the climate change, or will rise with the climate change. And then there's potentially more impact on whether it's the drought or not the drought for the levels of moisture in the forest, but they tend to be very humid, moist areas, and so I think that that level of moisture will continue. And then the last thing I just wanted to mention on this one was the tipping points. So very similar to what we have with human diseases, if you can keep the amount of infected people, and in this case trees, if you can keep them small and contained, then it stops it kind of from reaching those epidemic levels of disease. And that's the same with pathogens. If we can keep the spore loads, the inoculum, lower, then it kind of stops the pathogens from going out there and getting to a point where it's low-level disease which isn't causing an impact to a more severe disease that's really having a strong effect on the plants of concern. And that's what I probably am really concerned about. A lot of what we're expecting with climate change is those changes are going to be impacting the current checks and balance that the ecosystems have in place to stop that tipping point from occurring. But you get this massive change occurring, and then you have that potential that some of these pathogens could go rampant or could increase beyond what we currently see them. So I'm going to give a little bit of a case study with myrtle rust to give you an idea of sort of the thinking. I mean, I know this is a diverse audience. You'll have a lot of different plant species that will be of interest to you, but just to give an example, and myrtle rust is very topical at the moment. It affects Mutaceae, blew in from Australia about 2 years ago. Some of the key species that it will impact or is impacting is ramarama, pahurikawa, and manuka. So, and these are pictures I have of all of the different species that are infected with myrtle rust. Also got on the side there a picture of where the distribution was in May 2019. I know it has increased and is present in other regions across New Zealand since then, but there hasn't been a lot of formal surveillance for quite some time. And a lot of the questions we have is, well, what is going to happen in New Zealand with myrtle rust under a changing climate? So in New Zealand, the conditions are not necessarily completely optimal for the pathogen. In Australia, the east coast of Australia is perfect conditions for it. So it's warm, and they also have quite a bit of moisture. They don't get a lot of myrtle rust in the summer months when it's really dry, but they get a lot of it over spring, autumn, and winter. So they have a very long, extended season. Conversely, in New Zealand, the season tends to be a little bit shorter, so it occurs more over the summer months, but not so much in the winter months because it's cooler. Well, clearly, under a changing climate, that's going to be a huge concern. So just to give you an idea of how the climate can really impact disease infection, I've just pulled up this graph here. And so this is the risk of infection of myrtle rust across New Zealand from March 2019. So it's done week by week. And I find it really incredible to see just how much variation there can be. So you've got to the end of the start, which basically you're not going to have had very much myrtle rust infection occur, but then you've got these weeks in between where it would be a high risk of it occurring. And under a changing climate, I'd expect those graphs to become more red. And thus there is potentially more of New Zealand that will be more susceptible to a disease like this. So if I go back to the disease drivers that I had and I overlay that for myrtle rust, so as I've mentioned, the increase in temperature, we're likely to see more disease because it likes warm temperature. Increase in moisture, it likes that humidity. If it's really, really drought-like conditions, it's probably low, but we have the winter months, which potentially will be warmer and still wet enough, where we could get a lot of myrtle rust coming in. I think that the extended droughts is likely to decrease the likelihood of infection. Myrtle rust likes really healthy trees, and so I think that the stress of the plants in this case will lower it. Similar with the waterlogged soils, it likes healthy trees. However, if the waterlogged soils aren't constant and you've just got this water that provides more moisture, then potentially you will get more infection. The severe frosts is going to be a problem. It likes new flush, and so with the frost, when the actual frost occurs, it's not favourable for myrtle rust, but afterwards, if you're getting lots of new flush coming from the trees, that's exactly the kind of material that the rust likes to infect. Storms, increased movement of spores. Host phenology, we've got changes with the flowering in the new flush. You saw the picture before of the manuka flower infected with myrtle rust. What's going to happen with that if we have this extended growing season and more of these flowers potentially coming out with optimal conditions and new tissue that can be affected? I'm not exactly sure what's going to happen with the insects. We do know that it is spread by the insects, but the role of insects in myrtle rust isn't particularly well understood. And for the landscapes, we know that it would increase in the urban environments. The temperatures will go up probably to far more of an optimal temperature for the rust. The productive and the natural systems have lower temperatures, but they're going to go up probably more to a level of what we'd see in the urban landscape. So all in all, it looks like there definitely would be more of a risk from myrtle rust going forward, and that is a concern considering the level of impact we're seeing now. How are we going to deal with that in the future? So then the second question that I was going to talk about was, can we expect new pathogens and disease problems? The short answer is yes. I'd expect to be seeing more new diseases caused by new to science species. But I would say that just because you've got a new disease being caused doesn't mean it's going to be severe. So lots of different pathogens out there, they're fine, that's part of the ecosystem, that's part of the functioning of the environment, of the Ngāhere, but it's just when those ones get to that point where they reach over that tipping point and cause the severe disease and take it beyond what the natural environment can manage or deal with itself. And so just on this part about what kind of organism we're seeing, all plants are absolutely covered and contain huge numbers of different microbes. So all sorts of things live over them. I've got a picture here on I think it's the left for you, and it's actually a needle that's been cut into 3 sections. And each one of those little round bits is a different fungal species, all within one needle. And so that's 8 different species that I was able to grow out. There will be a whole lot of different ones that are present in there that didn't grow out, and all sorts of other bacteria and other microbes that are in there. So they're everywhere. They're incredibly important. They all have a role, different roles. And then you have this sort of continuum of these endophytes which don't cause disease down to pathogens that do cause disease in their hosts. And that's a small group. And as I've said, pathogens that cause disease symptoms aren't bad. It's just when they get to that point where they're causing really, really destructive problems, that's where the real issues arise. But they are very small group in the whole, considering the whole group of microbes that are out there. And so what we're expecting to see with climate change is that we're going to get a shift in the communities. So the climate, the warmer environment is going to suit some types of microbes, and those ones are going to be more prolific than what we currently see. And then some of them, it's going to be too hot and you're not going to see them as much within the plants or causing disease. So it will be a real shift, and that shift is very hard to predict. And we're not really too sure how all of this is going to play out. But as I said, we do expect that there will be more diseases. And so then the final part is what can communities do? So there isn't a lot at this point because we don't really know what's going to happen, and a lot to do with the biosecurity will be dealing with the situations on the ground as they happen. But my recommendation at the moment is understanding what pathogens currently impact the species of interest to you. So knowing what's out there, having that baseline level is really, really important. And if they are something that needs to be managed at the moment, understanding how they need to be managed. If they're part of a balanced ecosystem and it doesn't involve any interaction, it's just keeping that watching brief, seeing what's happening at the moment and what will happen in the future. And then that's that part with leading to the resilience. So being adaptive. We know it's going to change in the future. We don't exactly know how it's going to change, but that ability that when we do see change, we've got the understanding and the knowledge to make the right kind of decisions. You know, whoever is making the decisions on whether it's in your urban garden, whether it's in a productive landscape, or whether it's mana whenau kaitiaki with the Ngāhere in the natural estate. It's, do changes need to be made? Do we need to intervene or not intervene? And it will differ across all those different land uses. And with the new to science pathogens and diseases, we can't predict them, but that's the same as what we deal with at the moment. We often have new diseases and pathogens coming in, and that goes back to being adaptive. You've got to know that we can expect something to happen. We've got to be vigilant in biosecurity, and vigilant whether it's overseas risks coming into New Zealand versus spreading infected material around the country ourselves. And probably the biggest thing for me is keeping informed. So personally, I think that this summit is fantastic. This is exactly the kind of thing which really, really pleases me, because it's that part where you're talking about it, finding out a whole lot of information. I've thoroughly enjoyed the talks I've heard today, and I think that's really, really key. So I reckon kudos to everybody who's organised it and to everybody who's come along. So that is me. Thank you.
Kia ora whānau. It's pretty hot. I'm going to try and keep it short. One of the things I learnt in the army is towards the end of the day, don't be the last speaker and stand in front of the drinks table, because you're going to get bowled over. But I'll give a very, very quick mihi. I'll get stuck in, get some questions, and we can get moving. Ko aorangi te maunga tapu. Ko ruahine te pai maunga, ko rangatike te awa, ko taki timu te waka, ko Tairāwhiti te iwi, ko rata te marae, ko tāpui te tangata, ko pōtaka te whānau, ko Peter Fraser tōku ingoa. Thanks everyone for having me here. Where I come from in the Rangatike, and I need to see Chris about this, because the map he had was Ngāti Apa marching up the country and stealing our rohe. We kind of sorted this out in 1850 with some marriages, so I might have to go back and check those dowries, because that's our rohe that's got Ngāti Apa on it. So I'm going to go and talk to my upper cousins. But we have a kōrero that comes about one of our ancestors who first went into the Rangatike or Mokai Pātea region, and his name was Mātangi. And Mātangi came from over in the Wairarapa, and he was standing on the Tairāwhiti ranges, and there was this huge flock of birds, and he sort of thought, oh, pretty hungry, pretty good, I think I'll follow these. So what Mātangi did is he followed these birds, and through following the birds he went through the area. Certain deeds were done, and I won't go into that sort of thing, and he left mokai and other things at certain places which we still remember today. Now the reason I want to use the story of Mātangi is I am not from this region, so it's not for me to come and tell you what you should do in your rohe. Now, like Mātangi coming in here, I'm not trying to represent myself as Mātangi. I'm an economist. Economists are known as the dismal scientists because we are just really pretty bloody depressing. If you see people at cocktail parties, we're generally the people you try and avoid. So, back to my Mātangi story. I'll pull that back there because I wanted to see where you think I was going. Back to the Mātangi story. I'm not trying to represent myself as Mātangi. Try and think of one of the manu. Try and think of one of the manu soaring above the ngahere, soaring above the open plains, who actually provides a view that no one else can see. So that's what I'm here to try and do today. Okay, economics in Tairāwhiti. 20 years ago, I was the account manager for Tairāwhiti Healthcare. And I'll just update my little spiel I used to give back then. I said, I'm the account manager for a hospital where I'll use the numbers for today, there's about 50,000 people in the region, and they all live within 5 kilometres of an airport. 75% of them do. And the other quarter live on a bit of land about the same size as 2/3 of Belgium. And it's all in the middle of nowhere, and most of them are sick. And so I thought I'd do an update from them. So I went and had a look at Mr. ASB, because Mr. ASB has a website, and on the website they do a regional economic survey. And the regional survey from ASB told me Tairāwhiti is hot. hot today, but it's hot in a different way. What they said is that the place is booming. You have been the top ranked province in New Zealand for the last 2 quarters. So I thought, oh, this is pretty good. This is pretty good. I'll see what it means. So I've dug down a little bit. Your housing market's exploded. That's really helpful. It means no one can afford to buy. It says that you've got really good log prices at the moment, although log prices have been pretty crap for a long time. They're good at the moment, but they've come back off a bit. So you've got a big infusion of money because logging's a big deal up here. It also said that meat prices, and especially red meat prices overseas, they're holding up really well. So you've actually got money coming in. So from the ASB perspective, you're actually doing really well. But go back to Mātangi's birds. What does Mātangi's birds see? We see a hell of a lot of inequality. Dr. Rees talked about that. It doesn't matter whether we talk about it in terms of household income. Can everyone hear me? Okay, doesn't matter if we want to talk about it in terms of household income. Doesn't matter if you want to talk about it in terms of educational attainment. It doesn't matter how you cut the numbers. You know the numbers aren't very good. So if this wasn't a climate change conference, if this was a conference talking about economic development in Tairāwhiti, I'd say you have got some challenges. That is a little bit tough, but there's a lot of room for improvement. And by the way, your housing market's exploding. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is climate change. And that's just made everything infinitely harder. Infinitely harder. I want to start off by I want to go back to the very first set of slides that Sarah gave this morning. You know, the maps? I want to stop and just look at forestry for a moment, because it's the biggest industry on the coast. We've heard a lot of kōrero about Pinus radiata today. I don't need to go over that again because we've all heard that. But I've sat across the table from a lot of forestry people, and what they tell me, Peter, is say this: look, if we get an 8% internal rate of return, we plant. We don't get an 8% internal rate of return, we don't plant. Simple as that. Now, when you've got a forestry rotation of between 25 and 30 years, 2045 and 2050 is today, because you are making investments today about then. And those maps, if I was in a forestry company, would scare the bejesus out of me. Because the first thing I'm thinking about is, why on earth, when that's what the weather's going to be like, why on earth would I continue to invest here? Let's take that a bit further. It means that this whole particle board mill, which is going to be the saviour of Gisborne, why the hell would I put money in a particle board factory when climate change tells me there's going to be no bloody trees? Okay, so the first thing we've started to get is that I'm not going to invest. And then I'm looking at the trees and I'm thinking, I've got risks about fire, I've got a whole story about pathogens I don't understand but it didn't feel good. And so what I would be doing is I would be disinvesting. Now let's turn that round. What that means for you today: 25% of the jobs in Tairāwhiti come from either forestry, land-based industries, or agriculture. All are really, really, really highly exposed to climate change, and not in a good way. Now the question is that if we're saying that, look, climate change means that something like forestry is gone or will be on its way out. Because remember, what on its way out means is that when a forest is cut down, it's just not replaced. It will be depending on what contract is in place. If the cutting rights say that you have to go and replace it, then that will happen. But you can see that if the climate is changing and forestry is no longer a go, then it's no longer a go. What I then want to pose the question to you
given what we've heard about pines, and given what we saw at Tolaga Bay last year, is that a problem? Is that actually a problem? Because maybe it's about time the pines went. Okay. I'm just going to go back to some notes. I think that's quite a nice segue into what is the sort of economy do you want? And the way I'm going to answer that first, because what I've found with dealing with many Māori groups, it's been quite difficult to get consensus unless, but everyone knows what they don't like. So if we start with what you don't like, then we can then move on to what you do, because it's normally the opposite of what you don't. So here's a starter for 10 about something that I wouldn't be doing. The West Coast example of let's put a rail line in and build the biggest incinerator in New Zealand and have all the rubbish in the South Island put to us on a train and we then burn it. What a great idea that is. A lot of economic development. Suggest that's not such a good one for you guys. Another one, Wairarapa. Matua Shane wants to go and build a dam. Now, we could have a conversation all day about the dam, but for Tairāwhiti, I'm telling you, your saviour will not be a dam. Now, notwithstanding those pictures we saw of eroding hillsides and that sort of thing like that, the simple point is that dams produce water that's too expensive to use. We've learnt that with Waimea. That's the reason Ruataniwha didn't go forward, because farmers didn't buy the water. Okay, so we have a situation where the economy you've got here, according to the ASB, is doing really great, but I don't think that's the correct measure. You've got an economy that would be, if you wanted to get social inclusion and all those sort of things, would need an enormous amount of development. But the development mode you've got is not sustainable and arguably not even desirable. We've heard about the lack of participation by Māori. We've heard about a whole bunch of things today. So the thing which I'm really heartened by, and one of the reasons I love coming to Gisborne, is that half the population, or just under half the population of Tairāwhiti, are Māori. If we were to ever have a Māori economy, if there ever was going to be Māori solutions, if there was ever going to be a new paradigm about something different, then it will happen here. It will happen here. And this is where I want to end on the point, because I'd rather have one of Mātangi's birds just sit down and sort of get some nikau berries or something like that, and has a bit of a break. But Matua here absolutely nailed it this morning when he said, we have the answers already. We have the answers already. I mean, Tina and I, the last time we were together, we were talking about water, and it was about the Waitangi Tribunal, and the question that was given to me then was, well, what sort of progress do you think has happened? I said, well, no progress, to be honest, because the Waitangi Tribunal got the answer right back in the early 1980s, and they did it over the Manukau case. Because the gist of the Manukau case was, Māori said, these institutions have polluted our harbour. Our harbour is no longer healthy. We had this harbour for generations after generation after generation, and we looked after it, and it was healthy. Our track record is better than your track record. It would be better, not just for Māori, but for everybody, if we ran it again, because we did it right and you've done it wrong. So I think this is a real opportunity. I want to sort of pivot off Dr. Rees's point that he said climate change is a huge threat. But from a health perspective, there is the ability through diet and exercise and transport and mehr to actually get some good things out of it. You had this place for generations and generations, and I want to end on a Chinese proverb as well. Because my wife is Chinese and she'd be really, really angry if I didn't end on something like that. But I didn't put a mention in for her. But it goes something like this. China saw itself as the Middle Kingdom for thousands of years. It has a recorded history 4,000 years old. For the last 2 centuries, things haven't run so well for them. As far as they're concerned, that is the aberration. The 21st century is when things go back to normal and they become the centre of the world again. What I'm saying for you, what you have seen since 1820 or 1830 or 1840 to now, that is the aberration. That is not the norm. Take back the norm. Kia ora.
It's a pleasure today to present some findings from a research project that I did with Tui Womanhaven and Pia Pohatu, which explored some options for climate resilient Māori land, and it was supported by the Deep South National Science Challenge. So it's probably what a lot of folks have already identified to date, is that most of the catchment within the Tairāwhiti is at risk of moderate severe erosion. And landscapes like these could potentially become all too common. Some of the modelling that we did showed that under the different representative concentration pathways, or that's all the climate modelling that was done based on the different carbon that's in the atmosphere, that's going to result in factors for erosion increasing within catchments like the Waipu, where we might see the doubling of erosion baseline rates, where we have about 50 million tonnes per year being eroded off the whenua as of 2012, doubling by the year 2100. So going up to something like 120 million tonnes per year being eroded off our whenua. So those pictures that were displayed there, they could potentially become all too commonplace under those different climate change scenarios. So the impacts are going to intensify because the amount of storms that come through, similar to what happened in June, July in 2017 around Taiga Bay, are going to become all too commonplace. Storms are going to increase in intensity and frequency, which is going to lead to greater erosion impacts. Likewise, at the same time, going to get increasing levels of droughts and frequency and intensity, which could potentially lead to wildfires like what has happened in Christchurch around the Port Hills and around Tasman as well. But we can mitigate those impacts because tree canopy reduces those erosion rates by 90%. And at the same time, if you have a diverse type of landscape with different types of trees, you can also mitigate the risk of fire. So that's not to say that you just plant out everything in pine, because pine is probably at risk of fire, along with manuka as well. So there's a risk if you decide to convert everything into manuka or those types of highly flammable types of trees. At the same time, you probably have to think about fire and emergency management practices and introduce strategies such as green fire belts, so that you have a range of species that aren't as flammable, such as kōwhai and karamoon, or there's other types of coprosma types of species. But trees play a very important part in terms of the mitigation of erosion into Tairāwhiti. What this graph shows is that when you just continue on with our current landscape, which is primarily in sheep and beef, the levels of erosion increase depending upon the different representative concentration pathways of the level of carbon in our atmosphere, which then increases the amount of storms, which then increases the intensity of flooding events such as 300 mil of rain in 48 hours. That's pretty detrimental to our whenua. But if you have afforestation, whether it's indigenous afforestation plus production forestry combined, if you've got that tree canopy there, you can mitigate those levels of erosion. And it's important to note, even under those different representation concentration pathways, right up to 8.5, that afforestation is a significantly reduced amount of erosion compared to the baseline, which is in sheep and beef. So what are the options? Do we convert all our exotics to native forestry? I mean, that's probably what a lot of us want to do. And have some economic activity, such as honey, such as oils, manuka oils and the like. When we crunched the numbers and found that if we did convert everything into natives, financially there was a $1.2 billion loss for the regional economy. Likewise, if you converted all the exotics to natives and you just wanted it for biodiversity, ecological restoration purposes, no honey, no oils, then it would result in a negative $1.8 billion loss to the local economy. If we converted some of the erosion prone land, some of those gullies, some of those class 6, 7 and 8s that are susceptible to severe erosion, from exotics from those pines to natives, and then we had some of those areas set up for honey, some of those areas set up for manuka oil, then the net loss would only be 7.6 million for the economy. And it might be that's for the local economy, and it might be that's where you might have a scenario which is acceptable. I'll talk further about that next. And then you also might have like a partial conversion of some of the erosion prone land, leave some of it in exotics, some of it in natives, especially those gully and very steep areas, and have some honey production going, and the net loss to the regional economy is only 4.3 million. So note that these figures are based on 2 rotations of forestry over 2 years in the Tairāwhiti rohe, 6% discount rate, factoring in all the other benefits from erosion control, carbon sequestration, improvement in water quality, changes to value, lost profits from more production, and profits from manuka honey. That's probably the important point to note, is that the reason why it's so large and negative is because it's just a loss in production from converting that wood into tonnage to be exported. Okay. And the other thing to probably note is that it doesn't take into account all of our other values that we have important, that we hold important for the ngāhere. And it also doesn't take into account intergenerational equity. So the right of our mokopuna, the right of our other whānau to have the same level of access or more to enjoy our ngāhere, as well as to enjoy the other benefits from a clean and productive environment. And the other message to note is that it's not about trying to convert the entire landscape to one type of production like it is what is currently in place. We don't want to go transition to one monocultural activity to another monocultural activity. We don't want to plant everything out in manuka because that does increase your fire risk. But what you probably want to do is identify that there are some areas that are suitable for plantation forestry. There are some areas that are suitable for green fire belts, some areas that are suitable for ecological restoration, biodiversity enhancement, and then also suitable for sheep and beef. So it's not about changing everything up into one type of production, which is generally the norm in Aotearoa, which is generally the norm in Te Tairāwhiti. And what we find is that we've become incredibly exposed to the risk from those pathogens, from those climate changes, from the flooding of potential markets. If you think back to the 1980s, when a lot of our whenua was in grapes, and then the Ministry of Māori Development at the time in their wisdom decided that there was a glut in the market, and so they decided to pull all those grapevines out. So we don't want to have a situation where that is repeated. So the message is about trying to create these diverse landscapes, the right tree in the right place. In terms of the implementation of this type of approach, what we probably supportive of is that you need to empower mātauranga Māori, rights and values, and the governance of any type of implementation of a Māori economy or solutions towards adaptation and mitigation of climate change. And that means not disempowering Māori and marginalising Māori input into a process. Not incorporating Māori into a Pākehā worldview. But it's about recognising that Māori have valid contributions from their own perspective, from mātauranga Māori perspective, that can be used alongside Western science, that can be used alongside some of the econometrics in order to make valid decisions that influence the pathways forwards that are of benefit for our future generations. In order to do this, it's about promoting that Indigenous forestation has a role to play within the mitigation and adaptation plans within the Waipa catchment and Te Tairāwhiti. There needs to be greater coordination between GDC, MPI, and Te Runanga in order to ensure that there is an alignment between the aims and objectives for the afforestation strategies within Te Tairāwhiti. There also needs to be clarity around what are the implications of transitioning from the erosion control funding program to 1 billion trees. When the ECFP is wrapped up, what does that mean for our whenua and the ability to be able to access grants to mitigate climate change impacts, to plant those trees on our whenua? And at the same time, we need programs in place in order to have the agencies support the capacity building in order to recognise that, to provide the good advice about the right time to plant and the right trees to plant in the right areas. So agencies need to upskill their capacity to be able to do that. At the same time, with our Māori landowners, we need to develop the capability of Māori institutions to provide timely and correct advice to our Māori landowners so they'll be able to carry out those afforestation strategies in a timely and in a tika manner. And it also means providing funding and resourcing for our capability to develop the capability of whānau hapa and iwi in order to carry out that planting, to carry out that fencing, because there's only a few fences on the coast. There's only a few folks that know how to plant trees in the right manner in order to ensure their survivability. So we need those programs through our institutions, education institutions, to be able to support whānau hapa and iwi to be able to carry out that type of activity. And also recognising that there's only there's a few whānau, few kind of what I call local champions who are the ones that are taking the lead in these initiatives. They are taking the lead in terms of bringing together plans for local nurseries, that are taking the lead for carrying out planting days. And we've got to get around these fellows and these people in order to support them to be able to lead the way in implementing these strategies for climate change mitigation and adaptation. And at the same time, while the economics might be saying, oh, no good, don't plant Indigenous trees, we all know from a tikanga Māori, from a Māori perspective, that planting Indigenous trees is the right thing to do. Based on our tikanga Māori, that is the correct thing to do in order to achieve those wider goals around kaitiakitanga, sustainable resource management, around manaakitanga, about ensuring that we've got better connections between our whānau and our natural environment. So it's about ensuring that you've got a broad range of tools at your disposal in order to be able to make good decisions. If you want further information, there's a YouTube clip that talks a bit more about our ropu, about our project, Koe anō, nui rau te mea atu ki a koutou, ko hui mai nei, tēnei wā, ki te tautoko tēnei kaupapa, whakahirehira a rātou hiri ngā ahuarani. Nō reira, kia ora nō tātou katoa.